This episode was suggested by a listener, Neil, on Facebook. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. This episode contains discussions of laboratory experimentation on animals. If that's not something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Being healthy is taken for granted by most humans, but for those of us that don't have health, be it physical or mental health, life becomes an unyielding struggle. Modern medicine seeks to find ways to ease the struggle for those affected by disease and disability. Small adjustments can make a world of difference, but some researchers are more radical, their procedures seeming closer to the realm of science fiction. Like medical researchers, many science fiction writers have been focused on the science of health and immortality since the beginning of the genre. Through various paths, from transplanting the consciousness of a person into a computer, robot, or even another person, to cloning, DNA manipulation, and other biological pathways, ways to preserve the mind and improve the body have fascinated both medical researchers and writers. One of the biological pathways that went from science fiction to real medical procedure is organ transplantation. The idea of replacing body parts has been around for thousands of years. In 600 BCE, the idea of using skin flaps from a patient's forehead to replace missing noses was attributed to Sushrata, an Indian physician now known as the father of plastic surgery. It wasn't until the 16th century that early plastic surgeons had actual success in replacing noses with autogenous skin flaps, or flaps of skin taken from the patient to replace lost skin elsewhere on the same patient. After skin, kidneys were the next organ transplants to seriously be attempted. Despite many early claims of success, before the 20th century, there was no true success in organ transplantation, as many of these early attempts later failed. Technical issues with resupplying the transplanted tissues with blood, immune reactions to the new tissue, and infection at the site of the surgery were the major challenges that caused this failure, on top of a lack of technology. The idea of transplanting whole organs seemed impossible. Then, in 1912, Dr. Alexis Carrel, a French surgeon, developed a more reliable method of suturing, or sewing, severed vessels back together, using finer needles and extremely thin threads. His method protected against post-operative hemorrhages and embolisms, or blood loss and blood clots, as well as preventing strictures or vessel narrowing at the site of the sutures. Carrel was able to successfully use his technique for whole organ transplantation. In 1933, Soviet surgeon Yu Verony performed the first human-to-human kidney transplant, which unfortunately failed soon after due to immune rejection. This challenge was circumvented in 1954 with the first successful kidney transplant between identical twins. Throughout the 50s and 60s, more work was done surrounding the human immune response, which was discovered to be the cause of earlier rejections. From 1964 to 1980, steady progress in medical procedures surrounding organ transplants, such as tissue typing, dialysis, immune suppressive drugs, and organ donor protocols, made the process into the reality that it is today. Since the successes of the early 1900s, the idea of an even more complex, more science fiction-inspired form of transplant has captured the imagination of some scientists, as well as the general public. Head transplantation, transplanting the head of one individual onto the body of another. More recently, in 2017, head transplantation gained modern attention due to the well-publicized claim by Italian neurosurgeon Sergio Canavero that this surgery would imminently become a reality. His enthusiasm whipped up a media storm, and the public became fascinated. However, the medical community was more cautious. Any head transplantation procedure would involve the decapitation of the patient, severing the head completely from the body and attaching it to the healthy body of a donor, all without the head or body suffering permanent damage. As both the human brain and body require constant blood circulation between the two, and no procedure to successfully fuse and heal the spinal cord after it's been severed currently exists, this procedure seems impossible. However, these and other challenges didn't stop the researchers of the past. In 1908, Alexis Carrel and Dr. Charles Guthrie, an American physiologist, attempted the first head transplant on a dog. They attached one dog's head onto another dog's neck, connecting the arteries so that blood flowed to the decapitated head and then on to the living dog's head. The decapitated head had no blood flow for about 20 minutes during the surgery, and though the dog demonstrated reflexive movements due to oral, visual, and physical stimulus after the procedure, its condition deteriorated quickly and it was euthanized after a few hours. In the 1940s, a Soviet scientist named Sergei Brukhanenko developed a device called the autojector, a primitive heart and lung machine. Before testing his machine on humans, Brukhanenko did several studies using dogs. The most famous of these was captured in a 1940 documentary film called Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. In the film, the machine was attached to the decapitated head of a dog. The head remained in a semi-conscious state and responded to simple stimuli, such as the sound of a hammer or the administration of eye drops. Brukhanenko's experiment showed a potential way to keep a recipient's head alive while a donated body was prepared. It should be noted, however, that this film, while produced in Russia, was in English and was likely a piece of propaganda to show Soviet medical achievement during the Cold War. The authenticity of the film has also been questioned, as there are no full-framed shots of the experiment. Even those scientists who claimed to have seen the experiment for themselves state that the severed dog head only survived for a few minutes while attached to the autojector, as opposed to the hours claimed in the film. Brukhanenko did develop a new version of the autojector for use on humans that same year, and was posthumously awarded the prestigious Lenin Prize. The film is now part of the public domain, and you can find it on YouTube if you're interested. Fair warning though, it's quite graphic. The issue that most plagued head transplant researchers was blood flow after the head was detached. Not much headway, sorry for the pun, was made in this area until the 1950s, when another Soviet scientist, surgeon, and organ transplant pioneer, Dr. Vladimir Demikov, improved the methods for maintaining vascular supply. In 1953, he was able to perform the very first successful coronary bypass surgery in dogs. 4 dogs survived for more than 2 years after undergoing this surgery. Demikov attempted a canine head transplant in 1954. Demikov's dogs, unlike Guthrie and Carrel's, were able to move, see, and even lap up water. A step-by-step documentation of Demikov's procedure was published in 1959 and shows how his team carefully preserved the blood supply to the lungs and hearts of the donor dog. After exposing the jugular vein, the aorta, and a segment of the spinal column through an incision in the dog's neck, Demikov slowly and carefully exposed the small blood vessels, drawing a tight knot around each one as he worked. The spinal column was severed last. Because of this method, the head and forepaws of the dog were still connected to the lungs and heart, even though the head had been amputated from the body. Next, the main blood vessels of the severed dog's head were connected to the corresponding vessels of the body of the host dog. This procedure was tested on multiple dogs. The longest one survived after the surgery was 29 days. This is longer than Guthrie and Carrel's dogs, but most of Demikov's dogs still died within a few days. This was mainly due to the immune response of the donor body to the recipient head. At the time, the immune response was not well understood, so there were no immune-suppressing drugs to prevent it from attacking the new organ. Without an effective way to prevent rejection, most transplants failed. The next attempt at a head transplant was in 1965. Dr. Robert J. White, an American neurosurgeon, attempted to transplant a brain onto an isolated body instead of a whole head. This meant developing a completely new procedure. However, he faced the same challenges, and maintaining blood flow was still the biggest one. Also using dogs as test subjects, White created vascular loops to preserve anastomoses, or the surgical connections between blood vessels of the donor dog body. This procedure was called an autoperfusion because the brain was perfused or supplied by its own arterial system even after being severed. White then positioned the severed brain between the jugular vein and carotid artery on the neck of the donor. Using this procedure, White successfully grafted 6 canine brains to the vascular system of 6 large dogs. Though the dogs only survived between 6 hours and 2 days, when the transplanted cerebral tissue was monitored with an electroencephalogram or EEG, and the activity of the transplanted brain was compared to the host dog's brain, the transplanted brains seemed to show some functionality. White's procedure demonstrated the short-term possibility of a brain transplant. His goal was to use transplanted brains as a model in which he could induce tumor formation, meningitis, or encephalitis in order to test whether the normal recipient animal's circulating blood could possibly restore functionality to injured brains. With this breakthrough, White decided to try his procedure on a more human-like creature. In 1970, with much controversy surrounding the operation, White performed the first brain transplant, or as he called it, a cephalic exchange transplantation, on primates. He performed 4 of these procedures, in which he moved the head of a monkey from one body to another, using a direct suture of the carotid and jugular veins. The spinal cord was then severed between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae, a spot on the neck just below the head. Mechanical lung support was maintained throughout the experiment. 3 to 4 hours after each surgery, each cephalon, or transplanted monkey head, was able to chew, swallow food, track with its eyes, and bite. EEG monitoring showed that the heads appeared to be awake. However, blood flow was still an issue, and the monkeys only survived between 6 and 36 hours after surgery. The sutures in the jugular vein caused constriction, blocking circulation. To deal with this, the heads were continuously infused with heparin, a blood clot inhibitor. However, this prevented all clotting and blood loss became an issue. The blood circulation issues weren't addressed again until 2015, when a Chinese surgeon, Xiaoping Ren, experimented with cutting only certain blood vessels. By cutting only one carotid and one jugular vessel, Ren's method minimized trauma to the recipient, prevented development of ischemia, or inadequate blood supply to the brain, and also allowed for actual intact brain function. Over half of the mice he practiced this procedure on survived longer than 24 hours, with the longest surviving mouse living for 6 months. At the time of White's experiments, immunosuppressive agents were finally available. Using these drugs, White was able to prevent the occurrence of immune rejection reactions. However, this came at a cost. The high doses of immune suppressants contributed to the deaths of White's monkeys 9 days after surgery due to infection. It wasn't until 1999 that a combination of immunosuppressive agents was discovered that was effective in preventing rejection, but low enough in toxicity in small doses not to harm the patient. This new combination of drugs, nicknamed cocktail immunosuppression, was used in 2006 for the first successful human face transplant. Whether or not these newer immunosuppressive agents will hold up in a human head transplant remains to be seen. It's difficult to study immune rejection in head transplant experiments because of the short-term survival of the recipients. However, Ren believes that his procedure, which extends the survival of the subjects, will allow for better study of immune-mediated rejection reactions. If so, this research could lead to the optimization of immunosuppressive regimens for all transplants. Another aspect of head transplants that researchers struggle with is connecting the donor and recipient's spinal cords. During his experiments with primates, White realized that severing the spinal cord during the transplantation procedure resulted in the need for continuous respiratory support after the transplant to keep the brain and body properly oxygenated through blood flow. Fusion of the spinal cords is also necessary for motor and other bodily functions to work properly post-surgery. Before Wren's procedure, spinal cord transection during experiments was done between cervical vertebrae C3 and C4. Severing the spinal cord in this location doesn't preserve the brainstem of the donor body, which regulates involuntary actions like heartbeat and breathing. This spot also made life support machines for circulation and breathing necessary to support the severed head. In contrast, Wren's procedure, while still cutting the recipient's head at C3 and C4, proposes a cut on the donor body at midbrain instead, maintaining the body's ability to regulate the heart and lungs. Around the same time as Wren, Sergio Canavaro put forth his own theoretical head transplant procedure, one he called Heaven or Head Anastomosis Venture. A part of Heaven that set the procedure apart from previous attempts was a phase he called Gemini. This component of the procedure addressed spinal cord integrity by using an acute, tightly controlled spinal cord transection or cut. Canavaro believed that a controlled cut would minimize damage to the brain, maintain integrity of the spinal tissue, and aid in the recovery and fusion of the donor and recipient spinal cords. Specifically, he theorized that severing the spinal cord in this way would exploit a secondary pathway in the brain, a gray matter system that forms a network of connections between spinal cord segments. Numerous animal studies have shown that the connections may act as an anatomical bridge and allow for motor function and recovery. Besides Wren and Canavaro, other researchers have sought ways to heal the spinal cord that have not been inspired by head transplantation. In 2004, a team led by Dr. Richard Borgens at Purdue University treated paraplegic dogs with PEG injections, polyethylene glycol, a polymer known as a fusogen, which has the ability to fuse the membranes of cells together. When treated around 72 hours after their spinal cord injury, it was found that more than half of the treated dogs were able to walk within 2 weeks of treatment. Significant differences between canine and human spinal cords would have to be addressed before this therapy could be used in humans. Also, the spinal cord injury being treated in the experiment was a crushing injury, not a complete severing of the spinal cord, as would be necessary for a head transplant. But still, the result of the experiments were promising. In his Gemini procedure, Canavaro described his plan to use PEG to reconstitute neuromembranes after human spinal cord transection. However, this study and others Canavaro cited only focus on the efficacy of PEG in animal models. Similar experiments have been attempted on primates and appeared at least partially successful. However, the precise mechanism by which healing occurred remains unclear. An early trial of PEG on uninjured human volunteers has been completed, but further testing is required before PEG can be applied to injured humans. Canavaro also proposed that electrical stimulation could be used to accelerate recovery of the neurons severed during spinal cord transection, citing the successful clinical application of spinal cord stimulation, or SCS, in humans with spinal cord injuries. However, the studies he referenced are about injuries that are very different from acute spinal cord transection. Therefore, once again, further study is needed to understand how safe and effective SCS might be after spinal cord transection. Yet another issue to overcome is the distance between the donor and the recipient. If and when a head transplantation is performed on humans, there will be a period of blood pressure loss as the head is moved the short distance from its original body to the donor body. Preventing this loss is very important, as ischemia can cause brain damage. One theory suggests using induced hypothermia could reduce the damage during this transition. Induced hypothermia is a treatment widely used to protect the brains of patients who suffer cardiac arrest, stroke, and hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, a brain injury caused by oxygen deprivation. In White's early experiments in monkeys, he implemented deep hypothermia, cooling the body to less than 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit in order to protect the transplanted brain during ischemic periods of the procedure. Ren, on the other hand, was able to successfully carry out a mouse head transplant using only moderate hypothermia, cooling the body to 29 to 33 degrees Celsius or 84 to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition to inducing hypothermia, use of pharmacologic agents to preserve brain function after ischemic periods has also been explored. One of these agents, perphterin, has been used as a blood substitute during periods of hypothermia. It's been shown to protect and maintain cerebral oxygen levels in a randomized trial of 50 patients. While this seems promising, yet again, more research is needed to prove this process is effective in practice. One final technical issue that wasn't addressed by earlier head transplant researchers is pain. It seems rather obvious that having your head cut off and sewn onto another person's body would hurt a lot. But the quality of life aspect of that chronic pain post-surgery wasn't addressed until Canavero's 2016 paper. One suggestion for dealing with the pain is the creation of a selective brain lesion, basically an injury. The lesion would be induced in the white matter on the lower side of the brain and target the sense areas for chronic pain. It's been theorized that a high-intensity focused ultrasound could create this lesion without much blood loss and assist in real-time monitoring of the brain after the operation. Yet again, this procedure is still very experimental, and no clinical studies have shown that it would work. There's also the physical challenge of the patient learning to use a new body, which has barely been addressed. In 2017, Canavero stated that he intended to move forward with the first human head transplant in December. He was seeking funding to provide a head transplant to a volunteer patient, a 31-year-old Russian man with a genetic muscle wasting disease. Canavero said he intended to make a plea to Mark Zuckerberg, the man behind the social media giant Facebook, to finance the surgery. While I couldn't find whether Zuckerberg had financed it or not, I did learn that later that year, Canavero and his team performed his procedure on 2 cadavers in China, after Italy denied him permission to perform it there. The surgery took over 18 hours and utilized 2 teams of surgeons working in tandem, one on the head and one on the body. While Canavero claimed success, as the surgery was technically completed, it's still not known if it would be successful on living patients. Not long after this claim of success, the volunteer for the first living person to undergo the surgery changed his mind and backed out. While he was waiting for the procedure to be developed and tested, he married and had children. He didn't want to leave his family for months of surgery and recovery, or possibly death. His condition was stable, and he decided it just wasn't worth the risk. In 2019, many surgeons and medical bioethics specialists determined that not only was Canavero's procedure technically infeasible, but it was also scientifically invalid due to an inability to ethically justify its use. Some experts believe Canavero is a complete fraud, such as Arthur Kaplan, professor of bioethics at New York University and the creator of the U.S. organ distribution system. He questions that if Canavero has found a way to repair severed spinal cords, why not use it to help people with spinal cord injuries now? Kaplan stated that it's hard enough to transplant a face, partially thanks to the massive dose of immunosuppressants required. He hypothesizes that a head transplant would kill the patient in a few years due to rejection or infection. He also questions why Canavero hasn't published his procedure in any peer-reviewed journals so that other experts can review it. Dr. Xiaoping Ren has also distanced himself from the project, choosing to focus on researching the use of fusogens in repairing spinal cord injuries. Even with all the progress made on the technical challenges of head transplantation, there just isn't enough evidence to support it would ever be successful in a way that would make a patient's life better than it would be without the procedure. It's not known how long the person would survive, and it's very possible they would be in constant pain. There are also challenges beyond the physical that need to be considered. How would a successful transplant change the meaning of human identity? Though this procedure is called a head transplant, it's really a body transplant to the owner of the head. They are the ones who will wake up with a new body. How will the patients who go through such a life-altering procedure react to having a body that's not their own? How will the new body change their personal identity? Is there a chance that, even though physically the body hasn't been rejected, it could be rejected mentally? These issues will also need to be addressed before undertaking a procedure like this. Even further from the actual surgery, the question of who would physically qualify for such a procedure must be addressed, as well as who could donate. The cost of the procedure must also be considered, as the technology required to complete such a surgery is quite expensive, and the surgical skill required is quite advanced and multidisciplinary. What rehabilitation services would then be needed? Another possible cost is lives, as while the donated body could serve many as an organ donor, it only serves one for a head transplant. Even legal issues must be considered. If a child is conceived by a person who has undergone the procedure, will there be questions of inheritance and parental custody between head and body? Was the child produced by the transplanted body or the head? What about religious and gender issues? None of these things have been explored. Kaplan theorizes that the patient might never regain normal consciousness due to the biochemical differences between head and body, another element that has yet to be addressed. No one knows the neurological impact of putting a head and a brain into a new chemical environment. Chemical imbalances may develop, causing and possibly creating new mental disorders. Kaplan believes the whole idea is cruel and reminiscent of Nazi human experimentation. Kaplan isn't alone in his reaction. Many people are very disturbed by the idea. For most of society, a healthy person consists of a body and a head as one. The idea that these can be separated and still be healthy and human makes people question individual autonomy, as well as the soul-body connection, which is prevalent in most religions. Is it respectful of the dead to live in a deceased person's body? The entire idea of a head transplant seems to stem from one goal, the eternal dream of humanity, a life without death. Humans have always feared death and its uncertainty, and this procedure could lead to a sort of immortality. The goal of medicine itself is to extend life, so why does head transplantation evoke such strong reactions of disgust? Possibly because death has always been there and is the natural end of life. Possibly because the cost of getting to the point of immortality involves so much pain and death of both humans and animals that it may not be worth it, that it creates monsters of us all. Only time will tell if this science fiction turned actual possibility will change the world as we know it. Until then, fascination with head transplants has and continues to circulate in popular media. Many projects explore the consequences on human identity and other ethical issues that such a procedure would create. The 1962 film The Brain That Wouldn't Die featured a doctor who preserved his fiancée Jan's head after she was decapitated in a car accident. The doctor plans to commit murder to procure a new body for his beloved, but she doesn't want a new body, she just wants to die. A 1968 book by Margaret Jones called The Day They Put Humpty Together Again explores the possible consequences of such a surgery on a person's identity by following the fictional story of the first person to receive a head transplant. Another book, Professor Dowell's Head, by Alexander Belyaev, follows a doctor who kills his research partner but keeps the head alive so it can do the research while the doctor takes the credit. My favorite sci-fi depiction was directly inspired by real research on head transplantation. In the 2008 film The X-Files, I Want to Believe, Mulder and Scully follow a fallen priest's psychic visions to a lab equipped with ice baths, surgical tools, and a two-headed dog, where they find a young woman who's about to be murdered in order to save the preserved head of a scientist's lover. Damn, I love The X-Files. Even though it's not technically related to head transplants, during my research I was reminded of the Borg Queen from the movie Star Trek First Contact. She is a head and spine that exist outside a body, but she can plug herself into a body whenever she wants. If head transplantation were to become a reality, the world as we know it would change. People who might have died could live. The restraints that hold medical experimentation, such as funding and ethics, could be thrown back to make way for other procedures previously thought to be impossible. Science fiction would become closer to reality. On one hand, this could bring about a golden future where disease is no longer a concern for humans. But on the other, these changes could precede a darker, more terrifying age of human experimentation and inequality. This uncertainty and fear is what draws out our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this creepy community. Thank you to everyone who liked, shared, and commented on social media. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, make suggestions, and share creepy articles and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. There you'll also find links to all our social media and other ways to contact us, including by mail. Another way to support us is with gifts from our Amazon wishlist at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.